So short answer, yes. Also short answer, no. So let's set the stage real quick. So the big conversation that I've been having this week is about whether or not, or how rather, EU companies can compete in the United States. How they can compete with US tech, how they can move into the US market as a market and compete with American companies. And a lot of the conversation is around like the difference in regulation, the difference in funding, the difference in just the size of the market, and kind of how it all works together. So the example that I gave was the rideshare company Bolt, which is the European alternative to Uber. Now, Uber has really built their company from an American perspective around minimizing liability. They don't want to get sued. They don't want to put themselves in a position to get sued or do anything high risk. Bolt, by contrast, is trying to follow EU regulations. So you've got that sort of private sector attention versus that public sector attention in the EU. And here, as an American parent in Europe, we use Bolt almost exclusively because, in part because of European regulations, EU regulations, there's a minimum percentage of drivers on the road that have to have child booster seats. So a ton of drivers have child booster seats available, where that's basically unheard of in the US by Uber. And that's just one example of how a small quirk in the product can be the result of which environment the company started in and how that can actually influence your market approach. And that's a really, really strong point for Bolt to lean on what they do well and what the product was built to do from the ground up because of where it started in Europe. And it's a way that Bolt can actually get into the US market and compete for market share in the US. So let's backtrack. We'll set the stage a little bit. So here, even in Europe, one of the more common conversations that founders have is talking about how they break into the funding cycle, how they get into Y Combinator, how they get to Silicon Valley for the development talent, for the sales talent, for the amount of financing in the US market. And the big reason being that these are still the prestigious institutions. If you're competing for funding, you want to talk to US funders. If you're competing for accelerator programs, it's very common to reach for the US ones because they're the largest, arguably most established and best funded. That still carries weight the same way that like educationally Harvard does. Of course, then there's equivalents in Europe too, and there's a lot of accelerator programs growing here. But in terms of whether or not European companies have to compete with US companies, at core, fundamentally, all of these companies are making products. They're making companies, they're making products, they're selling to consumers. The scale of those consumers will vary, the size of the product will vary, the product itself will vary. But long story short, there's a ton of draw for European companies to move into the US market because it's a huge market, just a massive market to move into and sell into and compete for market share. On the US side, you have these incredibly dominant companies there that just have dominated the tech sector, like the global tech sector, for years. You think your Google, your Amazon, your Microsoft, they have so much of the backbone and foundational tech that runs all of software globally that stands out, right? And then, of course, China has the manufacturing base and a lot of the parts manufacturing, and the broader part of Asia has that parts and materials manufacturing really cornered. So, to the question, do European companies, or especially European startups and European tech companies, have to compete with US companies? Fundamentally, no. No, they don't. So, short answer, no. But the reason why is that these companies are launching to be profitable, of course, but then also to meet a need or solve a problem. So that's the goal. They want to sell to consumers and get money for solving their problems or making something that they're doing easier, to provide a tool or provide a solution. And there is nothing that means that a European company solving problems for European consumers or any other metro has to sell into the US. They don't. So short answer, no, you don't. Now, as for the longer answer, we're going to talk about yes and why European companies do need to compete with US companies. And one of them is just what I already talked about, is just that competitive market, this space where the US is a giant market of consumers, especially large commercial consumers or just high-income individual consumers. And it's a really good place for a company to expand to have a profitable launch. As for why, that's a reason why you would want to, but why companies on some level have to, is that we're in this specific tech moment where we're coming out of kind of a golden age for digital spaces, right? For digital software companies, where things like Google, things like Amazon Web Services, things like Microsoft Cloud, all of these different tools have built this massive infrastructure that other companies can build off of. So being able to use Google's basically indexed total global data from anywhere in the world is massive. Something like Gmail is groundbreaking, and there's really not a whole lot of reason to compete with it. And then Amazon web servers are really tough to compete with just because they offer a really good global product for anybody looking for web hosting. So all of these are like foundational pillars of software and software tech. And all of that was built because these products were the best offering out there. Really, just straight up, they were the best. They recruited a huge chunk of market share, and they've been incredibly stable and reliable for a long time. And if you don't need to solve the problems like web hosting and indexing data on the internet, why would you? So that feeds back to your no. No, European companies don't really need to compete with US companies. But we're in a moment where, especially with this massive investment in AI, where all of these tech companies have really, really heavily invested into AI, they are driven by their investment. They're driven by this sort of maximum profit approach. And the leadership teams of these companies are not the same leadership teams that built these from the ground up originally. They no longer are the best product on the market, just like without a doubt. Like there are cracks. There are moments where these products are falling behind a little bit in some of the fundamental ways where they initially did solve all our problems seamlessly and fairly easily. So, and then also from a leadership perspective or from just a company strategy perspective, because these companies have all invested so heavily in AI tools, they're actively sabotaging their own platforms and services in favor of that investment. And that's a whole other can of worms to jump into. But long story short, like structurally, they're falling apart a little bit. An easy example to say is Instagram, for example, bought by Meta. It's been rebuilt by Meta engineers and it's been changing a little bit over time. But one feature they just rolled out in the last couple months is ad breaks. And this one cracks me up. So this is a tangent, but bear with me here. So ad breaks are, as you're scrolling down your feed in Instagram, it'll pause and say, here's an ad break. You have to wait to keep scrolling to view an ad. And that's a way for Instagram to monetize the platform. And this is a monetization method that makes sense, like ad breaks, whatever. What's really funny to me about it, though, is if you have any kind of digital wellness app or any kind of digital wellness program, one of the number one things it does to discourage excessive use of screen time is to add intentional breaks where it's like you've used your screen time for the day, or you've scrolled too much for the day, consider jumping off. And all of those tools encourage you to stop using the app, to actually get off and go on to something else that you're supposed to do in your day. And now Instagram's ad breaks psychologically are doing that. The ad break that is supposed to monetize the platform and make it more profitable is going to reduce the amount of time people spend on the platform. It is the ultimate form of digital wellness to kick people off the platform and have them stop browsing while they're in the middle of a doom scroll, right? So in terms of consumer health, that's a really positive thing. In terms of long-term monetization for the platform, it's a huge mistake. Because like I'm saying, it prevents people from viewing more. It stops people from viewing content. It will encourage people to, over time, spend less time on the platform, which in return makes those ad breaks less profitable because people will stop using it. They'll close the app and go somewhere else when the ad break pops up. And the ad breaks are added because Meta as a company, as a large company, has to make up an enormous amount of profit based on the investments it's put into AI. Like these companies have to get very profitable very quickly, and it's to a degree, and of the amount of money they need to earn is insane. It's completely insane. And so they're pushing aggressive monetization policies that are actively harming the platforms. So dial all the way back to what I was initially saying about how these platforms meeting a need or solving a problem. As the platforms start to kind of break themselves in favor of more aggressive monetization, which is, I understand where they're coming from. I understand why the companies are doing this. I don't want to dunk on them. But the thing is, they've put themselves in this position where they're trying to hyper monetize the thing that they've built. That is what it is because it worked really well, because it worked seamlessly, because it was easily able to get people on it and spend a lot of time, which is how it made money. So all of these made money in the first place. So they're actively going to make these things make less money at a time when they need them to make money more than ever. All of that to say, and that's just kind of on the consumer point as an Instagram user, the consumer point driving people off Instagram. That's that part. Now, for larger commercial things, that's just the most visible option as just a small scale consumer. I can see that in Instagram. I can see it in YouTube. I can see some of what's being changed on these platforms to make the parent companies a little bit more profitable when they need to. The thing is, the parts that I don't see are like if I was an Amazon Web Services consumer, if I was a user of something like CapCut, if I was a user of something like the Unity engine for making digital apps, if I was an Amazon Web Services, if I was using Microsoft Cloud, the same monetization processes are being put in place for all of those as well. Google Photos, Gmail, Google itself, they're all adding in different types of monetization processes. And the point here is that these products, as seamless products that really met needs globally, what made them succeed so well is that they were able to encourage users to use them so seamlessly. They had a massive profit models. All of these companies were able to make enormous amounts of profits before this. And over time, we've slowly seen the products themselves get worse and worse and worse as they've been more and more monetized. And so the monetization is actively eating away at the existing profits. And the reason I'm saying all of that is because when we look at these major tech giants, we look at the decisions they're making. The easy assumption is the typical like adaptive fallacy, right? The same thing that you'd see in evolutionary biology. This assumption that anything we see live, anything we see in a living organism right now, serves a purpose. Anything is there for a reason. Not recognizing the messy, slow process of sort of organic adaptation and evolution, that means that things like a tailbone don't actually serve any purpose. They are there as a relic of a thing that's slowly going away over hundreds of generations. The same thing happens to corporate strategy. You can look at decisions, and if it's made by a Google CEO or a Salesforce CEO, you can look at that and assume this is the best possible decision. And that is a risky assumption to make. What you really should look is the whole spectrum of the decision, why they are the ones making this decision now, why this is the decision they're making, and what other stakeholders are involved. And then you can really examine, like, is this the correct response in this moment? If this decision maker had all the freedom in the world to make choices, is this the decision they would have made? Or is this the result of some other decisions downstream? Or is this influence from other decision makers upstream? And so this is the moment where any product-based company, number one, should be concerned. If you're using Amazon Web Servers, if you're leaning on Google Ads or Meta Ads as a core part of your business, you should be watching this and waiting and be vigilant for any kind of platform changes that will hurt what it is doing for you. Does it get more expensive? Does the reach go down? Does the effectiveness go down? Is the user base shrinking? All of these are things we should all be watching for just in case it's time to jump ship. And that is where this part is so, so important. That's where this point matters so very much, that Google, Amazon, all of these companies were built large scale on that basis of trust, that they were the best option out there, and they were so global and so big and so broad that since every company could use them, every company got increased benefit that every company was using these tools. So like Google Search is so good because everyone uses it. Google Ads are so good because everyone uses it. Same thing for Amazon Web Servers. They're so good because everyone uses them. But because they did so well, they were so big, they were so effective, they were so tough to build a competitor to, now we're in a moment where we don't really have an alternative to a lot of these tools. And if something happens to make these tools wildly ineffective, or if by some incredible happenstance one of these companies goes bankrupt, we don't have a fallback. And that's a global problem. That's not just a European tech problem. That's a global problem. And that's also a problem for US tech. So the big thing here is that we're in a moment where US companies are having a bit of a tough time. The US market, their consumers, their customers all still have the problems that these companies solve and need companies to solve those problems for them. They still need that. That's still a big part of things. But these companies are potentially either asking too much to solve the problems, or actively breaking their products, or they are just not solving the problems as effectively as they did. And if we're looking at an apocalyptic scenario, truth be told, we're looking at like things really going badly in terms of global tech, we need to fall back to these companies. And as consumers and as different developers across the entire world, we need a healthy market that can withstand one of the players going out of business. So from a pure survival standpoint, like it's almost insane to expect like Amazon Web Servers or Google Search or Gmail, any of these major platforms, it's almost insane to imagine any of them would go down. But we do also have to live in a world where they could, where they might. And so we need to make sure there are valid alternatives in place that are not subject necessarily to the same risks that those are, and who can build something comparable to fill in the gap if these fall and to give people an actual alternative to drive the market towards making the best possible solutions. Because what we're looking at right now is that these companies, these huge companies, have done so well for so long, and they are functionally a monopoly right now. So there aren't really safe alternatives to them. So every decision-making process they make is not considering truly healthy market competition. What it is considering the thing that makes most sense for the corporate leadership at that time, assuming that they will keep their customer base no matter what. And that leads to decision-making that kind of leaves customers in the dust and leaves the product behind. And if your focus is consumers, customers, and product, that's not a good place to be in. So, and I imagine most of the people watching this are some level of consumer and customer on both sides in equal parts, or some predominant either way. But long story short, if these companies go down, we will all be kind of out of luck. And that's a spot we don't want to be in. So we want to make sure we have a healthy global system that has multiple alternatives to these platforms, so that if one goes down, there is a fallback. There's a genuinely good option to lean on just in case, so we don't just end up without an option. And also we want to make sure that these companies are kind of healthily competing with each other, so that there's a lot of pressure to actually keep your customers, to do appropriate customer service, to do good like customer facing interface changes, to make a product that customers want that solves their problems in an effective way, which we haven't had for a while. And why I make such a point that it should be based in Europe is both because that's a cool thing for Europe to have their own basis for these things, and because I think European tech is definitely ready to pick that up, but also because one of the things about the global tech giants right now is that they're all US based. So they're all subject to the whims of the investment corporate customer culture in the US, which is another weak point. And so we want to make sure that each individual company is based on, has some variety in terms of governmental, regulatory, and economic pressures, so that there is some extra insurance that everything balances out well. And again, the whole focus here is on the best products, the best sustainable, profitable companies for all markets. I don't want to dunk on any one market or celebrate any one market dominant over the other. I just wanted to make sure to take the time to highlight why competition matters and why this is really important for particularly European tech to find alternatives to these kind of platforms. It is an opportune moment, it is a reasonable moment, and it's a arguably important moment for this. And that's where we are here. So that's my hot take. I would love to hear some takes on this, and yeah, let me know what you think. Cheers.